Climate change has become one of those subjects that almost everybody has an opinion on. Some see it as the defining challenge of our time, and others are skeptical. Many simply feel overwhelmed by the scale of it and switching off altogether. Politics, social media, and 24-hour news have made it increasingly difficult to separate evidence from opinion. But every now and then it's worth stepping back and asking a simple question. What does the science say? Today's guest is well placed to answer that. Professor Peter Thorne is widely regarded as one of Ireland's leading climate scientists. He is Professor of Physical Geography at Maynooth University and Director of the Irish Climate Analysis and Research Unit known as ICARUS, but his work extends far beyond Ireland. Over the course of his career, Professor Thorne has become one of the world's leading experts in observing and measuring climate change itself. His research has helped shape the global understanding of how our climate is changing. Professor Thorne has held senior leadership roles within the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. In fact, as you'll hear during this conversation, he's one of only a handful of people who have served in virtually every author role within the IPCC. The IPCC isn't a campaigning organisation. It doesn't conduct its own experiments. Instead, it brings together thousands of scientists from around the world to assess the totality of the available evidence and to establish what the science can and cannot say with confidence. Those assessments form the scientific foundation upon which climate policy across the globe is built. In this conversation, we explore not only the science but also the challenge of communicating the science in an increasingly polarised world. We discuss tipping points, Ireland's future, the responsibilities of governments and individuals, and also what it feels like to spend a career studying a problem whose consequences will be felt for generations to come. This is my conversation with Professor Peter Thorne. Professor Thorne, thank you so much for joining us today and bringing some of your wisdom to us here on Philosopheckery. You've worked with the IPCC. Can you explain what the IPCC actually does and what your role was?
So I'm still in the IPCC process right now. In fact, I'm one of a handful of people who've probably done every author role there is in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's what IPCC stands for. It's charged by governments with performing an assessment of the available literature on a periodic basis to decide what the state of the science is. And it's a bunch of chapters, and then there's a technical summary and a summary for policymakers. And that summary for policymakers is the thing that is approved line by every government. So when that summary for policymakers makes statements such as climate change is unequivocal, that's not me as an individual author saying that. That's the collection of authors. And then every single government in the world, some of them incredibly reluctantly, agreeing that that is the state of the science. And it performs its reviews every 6-7 years.
Okay. And I've heard this now, maybe you can correct me, see if I'm right or wrong, that a lot of the governments involved in kind of reviewing it, they have kind of vested interest in the fossil fuel industry. And so it's quite hard for you to push through the actual, how would you say, the strongest claims that you're making. Is it a fact that it's kind of tampered down a little bit even?
I wouldn't say it's tampered down per se, but you're absolutely right. There are governments bring their baggage to the process. Quite clearly, it would be perverse if they didn't bring their national interests to an intergovernmental process. It is ultimately a negotiation, but the science is generally accepted. It's challenged. They kick the proverbial tires, but in general, the things are accepted, and often that approval process sharpens and improves the text in important and valuable ways. And remember, for every country that's coming with a vested fossil fuel interest, you have a small island that's got land that maybe goes at most 10 meters above sea level that brings a completely different perspective. So, quite rightly, the governments come with their national interest. Why would they not?
And is there, you mentioned the small islands there that might be more adversely affected or sooner affected by climate change. Is there more weight given to their opinions or to them?
I wouldn't say there's more weight given to anyone's opinions. There is obviously in any large group discussion, there 5% of the participants dominate 95% of the discourse. But show me a large group process where that doesn't happen, where you don't have a small number of focal individuals dominate the process, and it's exactly the same in something like the IPCC.
Okay. For someone who's skeptical, and there are a few out there, what's the single strongest piece of evidence that climate change is happening because of human activity?
So it's the weight of evidence that makes us in IPCC not just say it's unequivocal climate change is happening, but now in the latest assessment report, it's unequivocal that humans are making that happen. It's not the single piece of evidence. It's not the smoking bullet. It's the fact that to explain everything we see across multiple aspects of the climate system adequately, you have to invoke human influences through the burning of fossil fuels, principally emissions of greenhouse gases, to actually be able to adequately explain what's happened. If it all rested on one parameter on say thermometers of near surface air temperature, it would be much lower confidence. It's all these lines of evidence. It's explaining the depleting glaciers, the changes in precipitation patterns, changes in things like humidity, sea ice sheets, all of these things. There's only one unifying theory that can explain everything that we are observing in the world, and that is human-induced climate change.
And is the mistake I just made there by looking for the one specific thing, is that something that you come across a lot? That people are looking for the one smoking bullet?
I wouldn't say it's a mistake per se. It's an obvious question, but when you actually think through it, what you want is not one single silver bullet, not the single study fallacy. It's the fact that there are thousands and thousands of scientists that have made measurements using a huge range of techniques, in situ satellite aircraft, the works over centuries, and have written hundreds of thousands of papers. And there are vanishingly few analyses that, in any meaningful sense, draw a counter narrative to an anthropogenic warming world. And most of those papers have glaring issues that lead you to very much discount them. Look, I wish that global warming were a hoax, that we weren't facing into a future for our children that was bad. Nothing would please me more than disproving global warming. It's not going to happen, because this is rock solid physics. This goes back all the way to John Tyndall and other pioneers measuring the fact that if you increase the amount of carbon dioxide in a column of air, it increases its temperature. The physics has been known for almost 200 years, much of it pioneered, as I said, by John Tyndall, so Irishman. And here we are still with a lot of people arguing that the physics is wrong. It blows my mind.
Yeah, it blows my mind too, and I haven't even a smidgen of the information or the knowledge you have on it. And I get frustrated talking to people when they say things like, it's not human activity, weather changes, all this kind of stuff. It must drive you absolutely nuts. You must like.
Well, there's pieces of research that we've done and that we're increasingly involved in through a project that I now run called Was It Us? Within ICARUS in Maynooth, Conor Murphy, colleague, showed that if you could invent a time machine and go back and nab someone from 1900 and place them in today's Ireland, they would not recognize the weather we have now. The temperature and particularly the precipitation extremes we see now would not be recognizable to them. We have shifted the climate that far in just over a century. And then the stuff we're doing with Was It Us is showing time and time again human fingerprints on the climate, making heat extremes more extreme, making precipitation extremes across a range of timescales more extreme. We're just completing a retrospective study on the 2010 cold wave, which of course was a climate change is what's climate change type of thing, and we're finding that was extreme indeed, but it was made less extreme by climate change. And in a 3-degree world, something that extreme would be impossible. So you can wave goodbye to your very, very cold winters.
Yeah, they'd be gone. So would all our green grass. You kind of touched on it there, but the phenomenon of shifting baselines. Mm-hmm. So that if you took one of us back 100 years, we wouldn't recognize it. If you took someone from 100 years ago forward, they'd say, "Where's all the birds?"
Yeah.
If we took someone from now and brought them forward 100 years, what would you expect them to see?
Sadly, I'd expect them to be living in a 3 to 4 degree world, 4 degree warmer world, and that is a world that would be broadly unrecognizable. In terms of the climate, you would be sat in Ireland and you would think, what is this climate? This is not where I live. This is climate that would probably be something equivalent of either current day Southeast UK or even near continent France. Very, very potentially warm. My big fear is that in that level of warming, we trip one or more of the tipping points, and then all bets are off. I mean, if the Gulf Stream, if the Atlantic overturning circulation has shut down, then you completely reorganize the climate system in the Eurasian sector, and that has huge potential implications. So unless we get our fingers out, unless we finally wake up and all agree that action is required and then follow through on that action, we are going to be in a mess in a century's time.
Yeah, if it's even a livable planet at that stage, I guess, for humans.
Well, I mean, it's livable, but is it livable in the way it is now? I mean, Ireland's climate is not going to become uninhabitable. What it is going to become is unrecognizable. And what we need to realize is that we built every part of our society and our infrastructure on the basis of a stable climate, and a climate that we are waving goodbye to. So could Ireland exist in its current form in a 3-degree warmer world? No. Could Ireland survive? Would humans be on the island of Ireland? Absolutely. but it would be a very, very different island of Ireland. How we live, how we get about, where we live, even what we produce in terms of food, etc., would have to change in a world that is that much warmer, because the impacts of climate change are scaling very rapidly with temperature. It's not linear, it's super linear. It's a bit like the R curve in COVID. It gets worse very rapidly.
Okay, once we hit them tipping points, is it kind of a very hard to see what happens once the tipping points are hit, because there's so many variables that can happen and knock off each other?
So the consequences of tipping points are really well known, and I'm going to be really interested to see what Working Group 1 in the 7th Assessment Report comes out with for IPCC, because that has a chapter specifically on tipping points. It's quite well known what would happen when the tipping point, or after the tipping point has been hit or has gone past. What is less clear is when will we hit a tipping point. So we know that if the Atlantic multi-decadal ocean meridional overturning circulation shut down, we have a very good picture of what that would mean. It would stop the drift of the North Atlantic drift, the warm waters that keep our temperate maritime climate together. Summers would get hotter, stormier. Winters would get much, much cooler. We know the broad contours of what would happen once it had tipped. What we really don't know is when will it tip, and what warning would we get? Would we know before it had tipped? Would we know far enough to plan? Would we be sensible enough to plan? All good questions, but fundamentally, the main issue with tipping points is we know they're out there. We know from paleo evidence from the past climate that the climate can exist in multiple states and flip between them. What we don't know is when, what will be the trigger. Would it be overnight? Would it be over decades, centuries? Would there be time for us really to adapt to it? Or would it be such a shock that it would be massively consequential? Again, it would not kill every human. It would not decimate life on Earth, but it would be incredibly tough.
How is Ireland dealing at the moment with it? How would you say Ireland is responding? Just Ireland as its own unit. How do you think they're responding to climate change?
So Ireland needs to do two things. It needs to rapidly reduce emissions, and it needs to get serious about the fact that we are living in a changed climate and that we need to protect our citizens. And the amended Climate Act talks about a climate resilient, climate neutral Ireland and biodiverse Ireland by 2050, which is absolutely where we should be going. Are we going there fast enough? Not really at this point. That shouldn't come as a shock to anyone who's read any Climate Change Advisory Council report in the last 6 years. We are not moving fast enough. We are not investing enough. And I mean, you've got to recognise that climate isn't the only show in town for politicians at any point. And let's be honest, the 2020 scriptwriters should have been sacked a long time ago. And we have dealt with a lot in this decade. The decade in which we should have been concentrating upon climate action and getting our house in order. We have had a lot of things thrown at us. And I have great sympathy for politicians who cannot myopically focus upon a single topic to the detriment of everything else. But ultimately, physics doesn't care what voters think. Physics doesn't care whether the economy is healthy or not, physics fundamentally is the ultimate accountant, and all physics cares about is how much are we emitting. And sadly, we are still emitting too much.
Yeah, I've come to think that that what we're doing is kind of a work avoidance. It's like, there's a phenomenon social psychology talks about it, that when we get a really hard task, we tend to suddenly do all the boring tasks that we used to do, that, cleaning our boots, cutting the garden, rather than the really hard task. And something I think about this decade, it's like the IPCC report came out. It's like, this is real. This is really happening. And suddenly we said, remember that war and fascism stuff we used to do? We'll go back to that. It seems to be a lot of distracting from the actual problem of climate change, because it's not really in the news like it was 5 years ago.
No, it's not. But equally, I mean, one of the things you said there was it's hard. It's hard in that it takes money and it takes time, but it's not hard in that the solutions aren't out there, particularly with rapid developments in battery storage technology. Everything we need to do is at hand for that individuals and corporations and Ireland PLC can do. It's not like we're waiting on some magic bullet to either reduce our emissions to virtually zero or to make Ireland resilient. It is a question of choice. Ultimately, it is a question of values. It is a question of all kinds of things. But I've moved to zero fossil fuel living in terms of what I can actually directly control. So I have electric cars. I have everything else is electric. The heating, everything is electric. So if we were to decarbonize the electricity system entirely, my domestic personal emissions would be zero. Now I can't control other things, but also I've changed my diet, a lot less meat, no red meat, basically, to all intents and purposes. These are all doable things. You still are living in broadly the same way, in broadly the same context.
Well, first of all, well done. Fair play to you. You really sticking by your ethics and your morals. That's very admirable. And I find that hard to do, to be quite honest myself. I do try to minimize the amount of fossil fuels that I use in my life, and I do think about it, but I find it very hard to cut it out altogether. Yeah, that's admirable. Is it their personal choices you've made? How much of this is personal choice of the individual people, and how much of this is top down, or can they even be separated?
So I'd go back to what we said in the synthesis report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Governments must lead, but governments cannot do it all. So governments need to put in place the enabling conditions, provide the financial framework and other things. And that includes not just providing carrots, but providing sticks, that not being afraid to provide sticks that actually put people off, given choices. But ultimately, if someone really wants to buy a Humvee with 5 miles to the gallon, well, unless you outlaw them, which fortunately we have here in Ireland, you cannot do a thing. So I mean, a lot of it is personal choice. There are a lot of individuals who cannot see beyond the status quo bias. I buy a car, I put petrol in the car, I go on holiday by flying to Europe rather than taking the boat and the train or staycationing the biggest challenge we have is fundamentally status quo bias, that people cannot imagine heating their home with an electrical heat pump and not home heating oil, or cannot imagine a diet that is rich in vegetables, grains, pulses, etc., and drops the beef from the diet.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we have always changed. We have always evolved. You are not driving the same thing, living in the same way, heating perhaps in the same way as you were 20 years ago. It's just that you don't really realize it. It just creeps up on you. But there's actively moving is going to take time.
I feel like all you fantastic scientists, you do fantastic work and it's so valuable. But I wonder how capable the language of science is in affecting that change in people, in affecting that emotional change in people. Like I listened to the IPCC report, and it's good and it's great and it's excellent work. And I know the importance of the language within science. But I really wish there was somebody on stage saying, we are strangling our mother here. We are killing our life giver, in emotional language. Do you think there's a problem with the scientific language in trying to motivate people towards change?
When I was doing the synthesis report for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you realize it takes a village, that it takes all kinds of expertise, that it's not a physical science problem, it's not an economics problem, it's not a social behavior problem, it's not any single problem. Climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, which is an even bigger tsunami following it, are very, very wicked problems, because we have ultimately lost our connection to the lived world. We have evolved and developed humanity in a way in which we trash the planet. I mean, that's not at all a contentious statement, I don't think. And we need a diversity of voices, and there's a place for hard, dispassionate science. There's a place for constructive policy discussion. There's places for all kinds of things. My fear with people who just entirely stand outside the tent and refuse to engage in the policy sphere and refuse to engage in kind of consensus building is that they may be doing more harm than good. I mean, you're better off inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing onto the outside. You're not making any difference if you're seen as a destructive influence, that you're not solution focused, and you can still be critical so long as you're constructively critical. And the question is, where do you work? And there are a plethora of views on this, and I have colleagues who are very firmly on if I engage at all in it, I'm compromised, versus my personal view: get your hands mucky, muck in, and affect change from inside.
Okay. Yeah, I think what we were talking about, the people driving the Humvee, and we have to kind of make it illegal or legislate against these things. I think a big motivator for people is social pressure and shame. And I think there's a shame that's missing in how we're treating the natural world, the rest of nature. And that's kind of where I think we need the poets. We need
Yeah. Oh, look. We need the whole village. We need the artists. We need the actors. We need the poets. We need the economists. We need everyone. ultimately it's the big village of humanity, and pretending that any one discipline or any one individual has all the answers is straight onto the road of ruin, and plays to egotisms and all kinds of things that is not. This is a tragedy of humanity, and it will take humanity and not a human to get us out of it.
Yes, yeah, we're still looking for Jesus to come back and help and save us, perhaps. We've talked about Ireland,
Yeah.
and Ireland is lucky that it's quite northern in the hemisphere. So we get that really nice cool from the north, and then we get the AMOC bringing the heat. But there's places around the equator, there's places in the southern hemisphere that are going to be affected a lot more than Ireland, a lot sooner, that are being affected right now. And that's going to have other ramifications because Ireland does not live in a vacuum on this world. How do you think the impacts of climate change on other parts of the world will have a runoff effect on Ireland without the direct climate change to Ireland?
So we live in a massively interconnected world. Just look at what happens when a couple of countries decide to throw bombs at each other a third of the way around the world, and the implications that ripple out from that. And we're only starting to see the implications from that bear out at this point. The countries in the equatorial region, least responsible, most vulnerable, already feeling the impacts of climate change in very, very major ways. Already, climate change is a driver of migration in very specific circumstances. But as we continue to warm the planet further, that will become more and more obvious, more and more acute. So yes, if you warm the world to 3-4 degrees, many parts of the world become de facto uninhabitable. It either takes ridiculous amounts of money and infrastructure to make them de facto inhabitable, or people move. Many of the places that would become uninhabitable are already in situations of precarity. They cannot afford to invest billions and billions that would be required to climate proof them. So what are they going to do? They're either going to die there or they're going to move. That's the stark reality. Now it's not a problem that's necessarily going to happen overnight, but there are real challenges. And if you go to the UNFCCC negotiations on climate, or even the IPCC approval, you see this stark divide. For much of the global south that has limited or no historical responsibility, has not contributed to the problem, they desperately, and this brings us back full circle to your early questions, their position quite rightly is adaptation, repatriation, loss and damage. You made this problem for me, you need to make it better. And then you have countries in the global north who have made most of the problem, who are perhaps only seeing a proportion of the impacts that the global south are feeling, trying desperately to wash their hands of that historical responsibility. One of the fundamental challenges of climate change is those most responsible are most insulated from its impacts, and those least responsible, both in terms of countries but also within countries, are most vulnerable. Many of those most vulnerable in Ireland are some of the poorest, most precarious citizens in Ireland who have not been able to fly anywhere, have bought very, very economical second-hand cars, cannot afford rich cuts of red meat. They're not the major contributor to climate change in Ireland. It's the richest, the people who jet off, the people who have afforded to retrofit their homes, install air conditioning, who are laughing all the way to the bank and are not feeling the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, that is a harsh reality, and not only are the people most responsible, most protected from it, but it seems the people most responsible, the nations most responsible, have the most power to change it, and maybe the least incentive. It coming to the end now. The IPCC 6 report came out, and your advice was rather strong and stark, and everything everywhere needs to change.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're coming up to the IPCC 7 report. How much has changed? Have we reduced our fossil fuel use? Have we reduced our energy use? Has there been any improvements that we can point to?
So in Ireland, we have managed to reduce emissions nowhere near at the pace required, but we have reduced emissions. In other parts of the world, it's different in different countries. I mean, countries like China are forging ahead. And if China hadn't been forging ahead, we'd be in a far bigger financial mess than we are, because they've actively destroyed demand for oil sufficient to cushion the impacts of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, for example. So we should give thanks to countries like China that have done that, and then you have countries like the US that are determinedly denying science and moving the wrong way. Globally, emissions have yet to start to decrease, and if we were to keep 1.5 as even a possibility, we should be reducing global emissions rapidly by now. One of the things that will interest me is, by the time that the 7th assessment report cycle for Working Group 1 comes out, will we actually be in a 1.5 degree world? I'd say there's a reasonable chance we might. And is that 1.5 temporary, or is that 1.5 permanent exceedance? Is it overshoot, where we exceed 1.5 by a little bit for a reasonably short period of time, or is it fundamentally a world of exceedance? I would not want to pre-guess what AR7 will conclude. It will conclude probably in late 2027 or early 2028 with the Working Group 1 report, and the others will follow after. But we are living in a world that is already at the lower limit of the Paris Agreement long-term temperature goal. And realistically, unless we get our act together very, very quickly and very, very seriously, we're going to also exceed 2 degrees. And by the end of the century, I would not be surprised to see us in a 3-4 degree warmer world. I won't be here to live it. My children might. If I have grandchildren in the future, they almost certainly would.
Yeah, and we have to kind of think, what will they be saying about us? You know.
Well, yes, the future generations will look back on us and say, you knew what you were doing and yet you continued. Why? Did you not think of us? And in particular, for an island state like Ireland, this is going to be a huge issue, because we could, with real action, we could stabilize the climate for today's primary school students. Okay, we could stabilize the climate in that the temperature change would stabilize. We'd be in a new reality at whatever temperature it had stabilized. That precipitation would be stabilized. What we would not stabilize is sea level. Sea level is a huge beast that we have poked, but that beast is a very, very long-term beast. That it takes a few hundred years for the ocean to become well mixed, and the thermal expansion of the ocean leads to sea level rise. But more importantly, it takes thousands of years for the great ice sheets, Greenland and Antarctica, to catch up with climate.
Okay.
The sea level rise we have kicked off today will continue for thousands of years. If we stopped emitting today, we probably are committed in a 2 to 10,000 year time scale to 5 to 10 meters of sea level rise. And if we warm the world to 3-4 degrees, we are probably looking at tens of meters of sea level rise. Wow. That's not what's going to happen in our lifetime, but that is what we are setting in train. There are periods in hothouse Earth, in the Earth's history, when there's been no ice on the ice sheets and sea level has been 70 meters higher than present.
There's no more Galway at that stage.
Well, there's no more Dublin. There's no more of much of Ireland in a 70-meter elevated sea level. Now, that's not something we're committed to right now, but if we don't eventually decide to stop, that's where we could end up with no permanent ice caps. That's where sea level goes. So sea level, we have the agency to stop sea level somewhere between here and there. And the question is, where will we stop it? And even stopping emissions today, the scientific evidence suggests that we might be facing 5 to 10 meters of very long-term sea level rise. I won't see that. You won't see that. We'll see centimeters of sea level rise, but we will have kicked off a process that will eventually lead to real questions over the viability of cities like Dublin, Cork, Galway, Waterford, whether we will have dealt to future generations. Future generations will damn us because we are the generation that knew. And we are the generation that could have, but we are the generation that did not.
That is a stark reality, that we are the generation that knew, we are the generation that could have, we are the generation that did not. My question was going to be, what's one thing you'd like listeners to take away from this conversation?
Well, we don't have to be the generation that did not, but it takes real effort, concerted effort on your part. It takes also making clear to government that this is your priority. If this isn't your priority day in, day out, you're not awake and you're not listening and you're not aware that maybe you're following the Kardashians or something, but you're not following reality on the ground. And climate is just one part of the environmental challenges we face. And you mentioned earlier about biodiversity decline. That's another huge area. So we've got to become better stewards of this earth. Evolution wants us to leave the world in a better place for our offspring than we found it, and we are failing that test miserably.
That's great. There's a question I ask every guest at the end, and it's, if we were to rewrite the story of what humanity is, say for a post-apocalyptic branch of humanity, and you could add one sentence to the book, what would that sentence be?
We acted in 1990 when we knew we had a problem.
Love it. Okay. Professor, thank you so much for doing this. Much appreciated. And hopefully you might be back to join us again sometime. Thank you, folks, for listening to Philosopheckery, and join us again.